They laughed when my sister said we don't sit with your kind. Even my father nodded in agreement, and they placed me at a folding table next to the kitchen while they posed for family photos. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. That night I made one phone call, and by morning the house they were celebrating in didn't belong to them anymore. I'm Grace Whitmore, and this is how being excluded became the best thing that ever happened to me. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Snow was falling in slow, lazy swirls over Bellevue that night, the kind that softened streetlights and made everything look too calm to be real. I parked at the end of the driveway, staring up at my sister's house. A 3-story monument to perfection, glowing gold against the December dark. Through the window, I could already see people laughing, glasses raised, the kind of Christmas scene people post online to prove they're happy. I pulled my gray wool coat tighter, took one steady breath, and told myself to just get through dinner. When the front door opened, the housekeeper smiled politely, that well-trained kind of warmth that didn't reach her eyes. "Ms. Whitmore, please come in," she said, stepping aside. The scent hit me first. Cinnamon candles, roasted ham, and something expensive I couldn't name. Somewhere deeper in the house, a jazz version of Silent Night played under the low hum of conversation. Lauren's voice carried from the dining room before I even saw her. She was directing a photographer, of course. No, move the centerpiece 2 inches to the left. Ethan tilted the champagne bottle toward the camera. When she finally turned, she was all sequins and confidence, her red dress shimmering like it had been made to reflect attention. "Grace," she said, that bright, brittle excitement coating every word. "You made it. I almost thought you'd skip another Christmas." I smiled. Traffic was bad, but I didn't want to miss it. She looked me over. The gray sweater dress, the boots that had seen too many winters. Then her eyes landed on the box in my hands. "What's this?" "Gingerbread," I said. "Homemade." She hesitated just long enough for the air to thicken. "Homemade. That's thoughtful." The pause after that said everything. Ethan, her husband, appeared with 2 glasses of wine, perfectly polished smile in place. "Grace, good to see you. Been a while." "Since last Christmas," I said, and he laughed like that was funny. When we entered the dining room, the whole family turned. The chandelier cast a golden glow over the table, crystal glasses lined like soldiers, silver napkin rings gleaming. My mother. Margaret looked up from adjusting a floral arrangement. "Darling," she said to Lauren, "this looks wonderful." Then, without missing a beat, to me, "Grace, sweetheart, did you get my message about wearing something festive?" "I hadn't. I just smiled. This is festive for me." Lauren giggled, shaking her head. "Oh, Grace, you didn't dress up. We don't sit with your kind." The room erupted. That strange, half-awkward, half-genuine laughter people use when cruelty sounds familiar. My mother pressed her fingers to her lips to hide a smirk. My father, Richard, chuckled and nodded like she'd said something clever. "She never cared much about appearances," he added. I felt the sting, the same dull, predictable one I'd known since childhood. But I just looked at the tree behind them. A 12-foot monument to symmetry, glowing and perfect. The Whitmore version of love. Lauren pointed toward the kitchen, all smiles. "You can sit there, Grace. It's just temporary while we get pictures. We're keeping this table family only for the photo." Family only. The phrase landed heavier than it should have. I glanced at the main table one more time. 12 seats, none of them mine. And nodded. Of course. The kitchen light was colder, more honest. A small folding table waited by the window, covered with a plain linen cloth and 2 metal chairs that looked borrowed from a church basement. On one side, a bottle of store-brand wine. On the other, a half-used roll of paper towels. I sat down, listening to the laughter in the next room. The clinking glasses, the exaggerated cheer. Every few seconds, someone called "smile," followed by the sharp click of a camera shutter. I poured myself a small glass of wine and took a sip. It was warm from sitting too close to the stove. My reflection stared back at me from the window. The snow, the dark sky, and a woman who had learned a long time ago how to stay still in uncomfortable rooms. From the dining room, I heard Lauren's voice again. "Try not to ruin the family aesthetic. Grace." The words floated down the hallway, sugar-coated and sharp. My mother laughed softly, then said something I couldn't hear. I stared at the Christmas tree's reflection in the glass. The lights blinked like they were trying to apologize for the people who hung them. I smiled to myself, small and deliberate, then took another sip of wine. Through the half-open door, I could see Lauren's red dress shimmering as she leaned toward the photographer, her hand resting lightly on my father's shoulder. The perfect picture of belonging. The kind of image people scroll past online and whisper, "What a beautiful family." They had no idea how much of that beauty was built on silence. I glanced at my phone lying face down beside the wine glass. I could have left. I could have said something. Instead, I just sat there listening to the laughter, the sound of forks on china, and the faint echo of my sister's voice, instructing everyone to smile wider. I turned my gaze back to the snow outside the cold glass beneath my palm, and let the thought settle in. The one I'd been swallowing for years. This would be the last Christmas I sat apart. I'd been used to sitting apart for a long time. It didn't start that night in Bellevue. It started years ago, long before I learned how to sign a contract or negotiate a mortgage. Seattle, 2002. I was 15. Awkward wearing a dress I'd stitched myself from leftover fabric Mom said was too plain for company. The neighborhood Christmas party was in full swing. Music, tinsel, glittering glass ornaments. I remember standing near the punch bowl, proud of the dress I'd made, until Mom leaned down and whispered, "Grace, you're embarrassing me. You look nothing like a Whitmore." Across the room, Lauren twirled in her white satin dress, curls, bouncing cheeks, glowing. Everyone smiled at her. My father, our neighbors, even the mayor's wife. Dad's hand rested proudly on her shoulder the same way he used to on mine, before he realized I didn't photograph as well. Lauren was the family's masterpiece. I was the error they cropped out before printing. The memory stayed like a bruise, one that faded, but never healed. By 2010, I was 23, living in a shoebox apartment in Portland, and working as a junior analyst at a regional bank. The job was repetitive, the hours long, but numbers didn't judge. I'd come home late, make ramen or rice, and sit by the window, the city lights flickering on the rain-slick streets below. Every night, I wrote down my expenses in a spiral notebook: groceries, rent, utilities. Numbers, unlike people, made sense. Lauren was living in Los Angeles by then, trying to build a fashion line. My parents bragged about her on every phone call. "Your sister's brand got featured in a magazine," Mom said once. I congratulated her, then hung up and went back to balancing a spreadsheet for a client's loan portfolio. A week later, I learned Lauren's business had folded after 6 months. Still, she never stopped performing success. While she posted photos from borrowed yachts and rooftop bars, I spent my weekends driving through run-down neighborhoods looking for something everyone else overlooked. That's how I found my first house, a weathered blue duplex with broken gutters and peeling paint. The seller called it a disaster zone. I called it potential. The first night I moved in, the heater didn't work, and the windows rattled whenever the wind shifted. But it was mine. Every creak of the floorboards, every dent in the drywall belonged to me. I remember sitting on the dusty floor eating takeout lo mein, whispering, "We'll make this work." It took months. I watched tutorials online, patched walls, replaced pipes. My hands blistered, my back ached, but the house began to change. And so did I. By 2012, I had 2 tenants in the other unit, their rent covering most of my expenses. I saved every extra dollar. When my coworkers went out for happy hour, I went to hardware stores, collecting receipts instead of memories. I didn't realize I was building a life they wouldn't understand. By 2015, I'd quit the bank and started my own company. Whitmore Capital Holdings. Just me, a laptop, and a secondhand desk. People laughed when I introduced myself as a property investor. One man at a networking event said, "You don't look like someone who flips houses." I smiled and thought, exactly. That year I bought 3 foreclosures, then 5. The portfolio grew slowly, one decision at a time. Meanwhile, Lauren reappeared in Portland, reinventing herself as a lifestyle influencer. She launched a blog full of curated photos. Brunch plates, scented candles, her husband Ethan smiling with the perfect amount of stubble. She tagged everything #blessed. Mom called again, proud as ever. "Lauren's followers love her aesthetic," she said. Then she added like a gentle warning, "Maybe you could learn a little from her about presentation." I bit my tongue. Presentation had always been the family currency, and I'd never had any to trade. I sent Lauren flowers for her birthday that year. A simple bouquet, sunflowers, her favorite, delivered from a local shop. She texted back an hour later, "Don't deliver cheap flowers. It's bad for the brand." I stared at the message until the words blurred, then put my phone down. The apartment was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on my desk. I turned on the lamp and opened another folder. Inspection reports, bank statements, property lists. I read until the ache behind my eyes dulled the sting in my chest. From that night forward, I stopped explaining myself. I stopped trying to fix their perception of me. They didn't need to understand why I wore the same coat every winter, or why I preferred spreadsheets to small talk. They didn't need to know that I owned more homes than the people who pitied me. What they saw as humility was strategy. What they dismissed as detachment was protection. Every time Lauren posted a photo captioned family perfection, I scrolled past without a word. And every time Mom mentioned my quiet little life, I smiled and let her believe it. Silence became my armor. Not submission, but choice. And the longer I stayed quiet, the more powerful it became. By the time Christmas came around again, they'd already forgotten how many times I'd saved them from their own carelessness. But I hadn't. I remembered every slight, every laugh that followed my name. I remembered the feeling of standing at that folding table by the kitchen window pretending not to care. And I promised myself one thing: this would be the last year they mistook my silence for weakness. The dining room was glowing like a magazine spread too symmetrical to feel real. The table stretched almost the entire length of the room, draped in white linen and gold-trimmed china. Candles flickered in perfect rhythm beside red roses arranged in glass vases. Lauren's photographer moved around, crouching and adjusting angles, while she directed like it was a fashion shoot, not Christmas dinner. "Smile one more, everyone, look happy," she called out, her voice bright and commanding. Ethan laughed, his hand on her shoulder. "You always make everything look perfect, honey." Dad chuckled from the head of the table. "Just like your mother." Mom tilted her head, smiling with that proud glow she saved for Lauren. I stood near the doorway watching. The sound of camera shutters filled the space like applause. Every movement in the room was rehearsed. Every tilt of a wineglass, every smile, even the casual laughter that followed her cues. Lauren turned toward me, gesturing to a spot near the wall. "Grace, could you step back a little? You're kind of throwing off the symmetry." I nodded, moving closer to the window. The air near the glass was colder, and for a moment I let myself look outside. Snow drifted lazily under the porch light, piling softly along the fence. The world out there looked peaceful, untouched by performance. Lauren raised her glass. "To family," she said, smiling wide. "At midnight, we'll post this photo. #FamilyGoals. They all laughed. I smiled too, though no one saw. They lived for the image, for the illusion of unity. Everything about this room. The matching outfits, the curated laughter, even the playlist of jazzy Christmas covers, was designed to say, we're fine, we're perfect. But under that glow, I could feel the old chill settling between us again, the kind that no candlelight could hide. Ethan turned to me suddenly, that polite curiosity people save for distant relatives. "Grace, you still doing your finance thing?" I met his eyes. "Yes, still." He nodded as if he didn't really care but needed to fill the air. "That's great. Consistency pays off." Lauren chimed in, voice syrup sweet. "She's modest. Probably doing just fine." There was laughter again. Gentle, approving, the kind that drew polite smiles from everyone except me. I poured myself another glass of wine and took a slow sip. Mom leaned toward Lauren, whispering something I couldn't hear. Lauren giggled, flipping her hair over one shoulder. Dad tapped his knife against his glass, calling for everyone's attention. "Let's all appreciate how lucky we are. Not everyone has this." Lucky. The word landed like a pebble in my chest. I let my gaze wander across the room. The sparkle of the chandelier, the polished silver, the camera flash. That froze everyone into grinning statues. They all looked like they belonged in some glossy ad for success. I caught my reflection in the mirror across the table. The same Whitmore bone structure, the same gray eyes. But something in my expression was different. Stillness where they had effort. Truth where they had shine. They called it humility when I stayed quiet. They called it failure when I didn't show off. But I'd built something real while they'd been busy pretending. Lauren motioned for another photo. Ethan straightened his tie. Dad laughed too loud. Mom adjusted the napkins for the 10th time. I stood in the corner just outside the frame, holding my glass low enough not to catch the reflection. "You can join the picture if you want, Grace," Lauren called out, suddenly a touch too bright. "We'll crop it later if it messes with the vibe." Her friends laughed. Even Mom smiled, though she looked a little guilty. I almost said no, but something in me froze. The kind of freeze that comes right before heat. I stepped forward, stood near the edge of the group, and let the camera flash once. The photographer smiled. "Beautiful." "One more." "No," I said softly. Lauren blinked. "What?" "I think one's enough." I turned back toward the window, the laughter starting again behind me, this time tighter, quieter. Outside, the snow thickened. Streetlights blurred into halos. I pressed my palm against the cold glass and thought about every house I'd ever bought. The crumbling porches, the flaking paint, the broken windows I'd replaced with my own hands. I thought about how beauty wasn't something you posed for. It was something you built. They lived for the lens. I lived for the work no one saw. The thought came as calm as breathing. You live for the picture. I live for what's underneath it. Lauren's laughter rose again, high and hollow, echoing through the perfect room. I looked back one last time. At the table, gleaming like a showroom, the people who shared my name, but not my values. And I knew with a certainty, I could feel in my bones, that their world was made of glass. And glass breaks easily. You don't sit with my kind fine. You soon won't live with mine. The cracks in the Whitmore shine began showing long before Christmas dinner. It was the spring of 2020 when I got the email. I was sitting in my Portland office surrounded by spreadsheets and construction invoices when the subject line appeared on my screen. Notice of foreclosure. Whitmore residence. I stared at it for a long minute before opening it, already knowing what I'd find. Dad had lost another investment. He'd always called himself a man with instincts, but those instincts had failed him for years. The letter listed missed payments penalties and a final warning 30 days to avoid auction. For a moment, I just sat there, the soft hum of the city outside my window. I wasn't surprised. Not anymore. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and exhaled. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney. Buy the debt, I said. There was a pause. Under your name. No, under Cascade Residential. Handle it quietly. He didn't ask why. People who work with me know better than to ask. 2 weeks later, I was sitting across a mahogany table, signing papers in a conference room that smelled like polished wood and coffee. The banker smiled, relieved to have the problem off his desk. You've just acquired the Whitmore mortgage, he said, sliding the final document toward me. I know I said signing. That's the point. By the time my parents received their official letter stating the foreclosure had been resolved, they believed it was a bank error. They even celebrated with champagne. Mom called to brag about how connections always come through when you need them. I told her that was wonderful, and hung up before I laughed. A year later, 2021, Lauren and Ethan decided to move out of their rental in Tacoma and into something more aligned with their brand. They wanted a house that photographed well. High ceilings, open kitchen, good natural light for her content. I was in a meeting with my property manager when her name came across the rental application. Drake Lauren, she read aloud. Credit scores, decent. Combined income borderline. You want to approve this one? I looked at the address on the form. Eastwood Heights, one of my better investments, and smiled. Yes, I said. Give them a lease. Market price minus $800. A week later, they moved in. Lauren posted a video tour to her followers, showing off the marble countertops. The big backyard, the cozy, elegant charm. She never asked who the landlord was. She never wondered why the rent was so low. They believed they'd negotiated a miracle. They were living inside one of my houses. And no one thought I could possibly own something that perfect. A few months later, her face appeared on the cover of a local magazine. The Drake's Building, a modern family brand. The photo spread showed Lauren and Ethan posing by their dining table, a golden retriever at their feet. I recognized the window behind them instantly. It was my window. My house. The article quoted her saying home is where you create your own success story. I laughed out loud when I read that, a quiet, humorless sound that startled even me. I set the magazine down, took a sip of coffee, and stared at the stack of renovation invoices on my desk. Success story indeed. That afternoon, Michael Reyes called. His voice was low, careful. Grace, I thought you should know. Lauren's been in contact with the Whitmore Family Trust. She's asking to be added as a co-manager. I didn't say anything right away. The trust had been established decades ago by my grandmother. It held the last of the family's old money, the assets my father hadn't managed to gamble away. My grandmother trusted me with oversight, but legally, my parents were still primary beneficiaries. Who's advising her? I asked finally. Someone named Nathan Lowell, he said. Sound familiar? Of course it did. Nathan was the same man who'd cost me a deal back in 2015. A smooth-talking developer who took my design plans, pitched them as his own, and left me with nothing but unpaid contractors. I hadn't heard from him in years. I could almost see him now sitting across from Lauren in some trendy coffee shop, telling her how he could help her secure her future. I pinched the bridge of my nose. He's after the trust, I said. Looks that way, Michael replied. I can stall them if you want. No need. I'll handle it. When we hung up, I opened my laptop. My reflection glared back at me in the dark screen for a moment. Calm, focused, colder than I used to be. I logged into the company account for Cascade Residential, reviewed the holdings, and then transferred full ownership of every property into Whitmore Capital Holdings. It took an hour to finalize. A few clicks, a few passwords, a few signatures. With each confirmation email that landed in my inbox, I felt something settle inside me. Something steady, something final. I leaned back, watching the last file upload. "That's done," I said aloud. The room echoed. Outside, the city lights glowed against the rain. I thought about Lauren sitting in her Eastwood Heights kitchen, editing photos for her next post. I thought about Dad polishing the silver that was technically mine. Mom writing her holiday newsletter about our family's blessings. They'd built a world on surface and illusion, and like old paint, it was starting to crack. People like them always thought decay happened suddenly. A dramatic fall, an overnight scandal. But it doesn't. It happens slowly, layer by layer, until one day you wake up and realize the foundation you've been standing on was never solid to begin with. I closed my laptop, turned off the light, and stood by the window. Rain tapped against the glass like faint applause. They have no idea, I whispered to the empty room. And they never will, until it's too late. That thought didn't feel like revenge yet. It just felt like truth finally catching up. The morning before Christmas dinner, my phone buzzed before sunrise. It was Michael asking if he could stop by. He showed up 20 minutes later, his coat still damp from the rain, a leather folder tucked under his arm. He didn't bother with small talk. "Lauren sent this to the trust office," he said, setting the papers on my kitchen table. "It's a supplemental agreement. She wants management rights transferred to her and your father." I wiped a drop of coffee from my sleeve before touching the document. The paper was thick, expensive, like it was meant to look official even when it wasn't. I read each line carefully, the language polite but sharp. In recognition of the family's evolving structure, beneficial oversight reassigned to primary heirs. "She really thinks this will pass," I murmured. Michael crossed his arms. "It's not a legal move without your signature, but she's betting you'll stay quiet like always." I closed the folder and met his eyes. "I won't sign." He hesitated. "Grace, if you push back on this, you'll expose the entire family's finances. Are you sure you want to do that right before Christmas?" "I'm not exposing anything," I said. "I'm just refusing to keep covering for them." Michael studied me for a long moment. "Then I'll draft the rejection letter. But you should know, this won't stay private for long. Nathan's behind it. He's already circling the trust lawyers." That name hit like the faint echo of a wound. Nathan Lowell. Smooth, ambitious, and poisonous. I could still see him from years ago sitting across from me in a downtown conference room. I was 30, then eager and too trusting. We'd partnered on a redevelopment deal, a rundown block in northeast Portland. He'd promised shared profits equal credit. I provided the funding, he provided the charm. The week before we closed, he disappeared. When the deal went public, the paperwork listed only his name. I lost nearly everything I'd invested. The night I found out, I'd stood in that same office long after everyone left staring at the city lights. I promised myself that would be the last time I let anyone use my work as a prop for their ego. And now he was back whispering into my sister's ear. Michael cleared his throat, pulling me back to the present. "You know he's manipulating her. She doesn't have the faintest idea what he's doing." "She never does," I said quietly. He frowned. "So what is your move?" I looked out the window at the bare winter trees, the thin frost clinging to the glass. "I don't need a scene. I just need truth to surface, in its own time." He nodded, closing his folder. "Then I'll make sure everything's ready if you need to act." When he left, the house felt heavier, quieter. My printer hummed as I printed the trust document and the proposed amendment. I slipped both into my black leather case. At 9, my phone lit up with a new message. "Lauren, remember to dress nicely tonight. We're all family." I stared at the text for a while, the smiley face at the end like salt in a paper cut. I didn't reply. Instead, I turned on the record player. Miles Davis filled the kitchen with soft, steady brass. I poured another cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, letting the sound wash through me. The clock on the wall ticked like a metronome each second, pulling me closer to the inevitable. They thought I was coming tonight because I still cared, because I'd do what I always did. Smile, forgive, play along. But this time I wasn't coming to make peace. I was coming to end it. The afternoon slipped by quietly. I double-checked a few bank accounts, made 2 calls to confirm property transfers, then turned off my computer. When I stood, the reflection in the screen caught my attention, my own face calm, unreadable. I remembered Dad's words from years ago. "In business, you never show your hand." He'd meant it as a lesson in power. He just never realized I'd learned it better than he did. As evening fell, the sky outside turned the color of cold steel. Snow had started again, thin and steady, layering the street like a clean slate. I dressed simply. Black dress, long coat, hair tied back. Nothing fancy. Nothing performative. Before I left, I poured myself a small glass of red wine and walked to the window. Across the street, my neighbor's kids were building a snowman under the streetlight, their laughter echoing faintly. It hit me how strange it was. How something as small as a family dinner could carry the weight of decades. I raised the glass slightly more to myself than anyone else and said under my breath, "Every ending starts with a meal." The clock struck 6. I slipped the leather case under my arm, turned off the lights, and stepped outside into the snow. The noise of silverware and laughter filled the dining room, layered with the faint hum of Christmas music playing from the speaker in the corner. Lauren was in her element, commanding attention, sipping wine between stories, tossing her hair back like every flick deserved applause. Ethan leaned in at the right moments, adding punchlines that made her laugh louder. Dad lifted his glass, smiling with pride. Mom beamed. "Lauren, darling, this dinner looks perfect." Dad nodded. "Everything's flawless." Lauren gave a little mock curtsy. "I learned from the best." Her eyes flicked toward Mom, then to me. "Well," she added, pretending to study me with playful amusement, except that outfit. The laughter came right on cue. A few chuckles from the cousins, a snort from Ethan. Even Dad joined in. "She never understood appearances," he said, as if he were explaining a long-standing family joke. I smiled. Small. Controlled. The kind of smile that hides a blade. Lauren raised her phone to snap another picture for her followers, turning the lens slightly so I was half cropped out. "Perfect," she whispered. I set my fork down, the sound soft but final. The laughter dimmed just a little. I could feel Mom watching me, maybe expecting another polite smile, maybe worried I'd embarrass her in front of her perfect table. Instead, I stood calmly. "You're right, Dad," I said steady. "I never did understand appearances." The room went quiet, except for the faint clinking of ice in a glass somewhere. Lauren blinked, uncertain if this was a joke. Grace. But I continued. I learned something else. I picked up my phone. No theatrics, no raised voice. Just a movement so ordinary it caught no one's attention until I spoke again. "Alan," I said into the phone, "activate Clause 14C on the Eastwood Heights lease. Effective tonight. Non-discriminatory breach confirmed." For a second, no one processed the words. Then forks froze midair. Ethan's brow furrowed. "Grace, what are you talking about?" Dad asked, his tone firm but cautious. I didn't look at him. I scrolled to the next contact. "Emily," I said. "Raise all rents under the Drake name to market rate." "Yes, tonight." Lauren pushed her chair back so fast it screeched. "You can't just—" "I can," I said, meeting her eyes. "And I already have." The air thickened. The faint scent of cinnamon from the candles mixed with something sharper. Panic. Dad's voice boomed across the table. "Stop this nonsense right now." I turned to him. "I stopped it years ago, Dad. You just didn't notice." Mom's hand trembled as she reached for her glass. "Grace, what is this? What are you doing?" I looked around the room. At the plates stacked with untouched food, at the people who'd mistaken cruelty for humor, at my sister still clutching her phone like it could save her image. "I'm doing what you all taught me," I said quietly. "Taking care of appearances." Lauren stood, red spreading across her cheeks. "You think you can embarrass me in front of my family?" "Your family." I raised an eyebrow. That's an interesting way to put it. Ethan leaned toward Lauren, whispering urgently. She hissed back, "Don't tell me to calm down." Dad slammed his palm against the table. "Grace, enough. You've made your point." I turned to him fully, now my voice low. "No, I haven't. You've spent your life teaching me that presentation is everything. The right clothes, the right words, the right smile. But what you never taught me was honesty. You never told me the truth matters more than approval." Lauren's breathing grew sharp. "You're insane," she snapped. "Maybe," I said, "but at least I own it." Mom stood up, halfway torn between defending me and keeping the peace. "Let's not do this at Christmas," she pleaded. "Please." I exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that empties years of restraint. I didn't yell. I didn't even sound angry. "Mom, Christmas is exactly when this belongs. Because every year you build this illusion, a perfect family with matching sweaters and matching smiles, while pretending there isn't rot under the wrapping paper." Lauren opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. You wanted a perfect picture, I said. Congratulations, you just made one. The photographer Lauren had hired stood frozen behind his camera, caught between professionalism and disbelief. The flash went off accidentally, illuminating the room for a single stark second. In that brief burst of light, everything looked raw. Dad's clenched jaw, Mom's trembling hands, Ethan's pale face, and Lauren's frozen smile. No filters, no edits, just the truth reflected back at them. I picked up my glass, finished the last sip of wine, and placed it gently beside my plate. The silence in that moment was louder than any argument we'd ever had. Lauren's voice came out small, breaking for the first time that night. What have you done? I looked at her, calm as ever. Exactly what you asked me to. I showed everyone what family looks like. The room stayed still. No one spoke. The candles flickered, one by one. I turned toward the hallway, the faint sound of wind sneaking through the window panes. My hand brushed the back of the chair as I passed, and for the first time in years, I felt something like peace. Behind me, the sound of forks and glasses shifting nervously filled the void, like everyone was pretending the night could still go back to normal. It couldn't. Not anymore. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound in the room was the faint crackle of the candles and the slow ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Lauren's face flushed, the color rising from her neck to her cheeks. Grace, she said, her voice trembling. Are you serious right now? Ethan was already fumbling for his phone. His fingers shook as he scrolled through an app, eyes darting back and forth. Then his voice broke into a whisper just loud enough for everyone to hear. Oh my God, she's not bluffing. The house title. It's under Whitmore Capital Holdings. All heads turned toward him. Lauren's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Dad stood so abruptly, his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. You're humiliating this family, he roared. I looked at him, calm as glass. No, Dad. You did that the moment you taught us appearances matter more than decency. He blinked, speechless for once. Mom reached out and grabbed his wrist, her hand trembling. Please, she whispered. Stop this in front of everyone. Everyone. She meant the cousins, the photographer, the housekeeper hovering near the doorway pretending not to exist. I turned toward Lauren. Do you even know who's been paying your mortgage for the past 3 years? Who covered Mom and Dad's foreclosure when the bank came for this house? Who made sure you could keep living your picture-perfect life? Lauren's voice was barely a whisper. What are you talking about? I did, I said. Through my company. A few gasps rippled through the room. And in return, you turned me into your family's embarrassment. The invisible sister you could mock when you needed to feel superior. Lauren's expression crumbled. You're lying. Check the lease, I said, nodding at Ethan's phone. Cascade Residential is just a management branch. Follow it back to the holding company. Every contract, every payment, every late fee waived. It all leads to me. Ethan's hands trembled as he refreshed the screen. It's true, he muttered. It's all under her name. Mom's voice cracked. Why would you do that for us if you hated us so much? I never hated you, I said quietly. I just stopped letting you pretend you were better than the people you depended on. Lauren's eyes darted toward the photographer, desperate for someone to break the silence. You can't do this, she said finally, her voice shrill. You can't take everything away. That's illegal. I tilted my head slightly. So was your misuse of family funds. And Nathan's emails. The ones where he promised to restructure the trust in exchange for a percentage. They're already with my attorney. Her face went pale. You wouldn't. I already did. Ethan slumped back into his chair, the air wheezing out of him like a punctured tire. Dad's voice shook with fury. You think this makes you powerful? You're destroying your family. I looked at him. Really looked at him. At the man who'd spent decades lecturing me on grace and humility while quietly favoring the daughter who fit his reflection. I'm not destroying it, I said softly. I'm just pulling down the wallpaper so everyone can see the cracks underneath. No one spoke. The silence was the kind that hums in your ears, a pressure that builds until it feels almost holy. I picked up my phone again and pressed one final number. Dr. Patel, I said when he answered. Please finalize the transfer of the Whitmore Family Trust. Grandma already signed. Across the table, Mom gasped. You spoke to Mother. She called me, I said. Turns out she prefers transparency to performance. The color drained from Lauren's face. You can't, she said again, this time pleading. Please, Grace, this isn't you. This is exactly me, I said. The version you never bothered to see. Mom's lower lip trembled. You're my daughter. Yes, I said. And that's supposed to mean something. Dad slammed his hand against the table again, but this time, there was no power behind it, only noise. "You're out of line," he said weakly. "No," I answered, my voice steady. "For the first time, I'm exactly where I belong." Lauren clutched her wine glass with both hands, knuckles white. "Grace, please, you're making a mistake." "You made the mistake," I said. "When you believed you could build your life on mine and call it success." Ethan's eyes flickered up at me. "What happens now?" I took a breath, slow and deliberate. "Now accountability happens." The word hung there heavy and final. The candles hissed softly, the flames bending, as if the air itself had shifted. No one moved. Even the photographer had lowered his camera, frozen. I slid my phone back into my clutch, straightened my shoulders, and looked around the room one last time. "This," I said quietly, "is what accountability looks like." And for the first time in my life, the room that had always made me feel small finally fell silent. Snow pressed against the windows in thick, silent waves, muffling the world outside. Inside, the air felt frozen, the kind of stillness that comes right after lightning strikes, but before anyone remembers to breathe. Lauren's heels clicked softly on the hardwood as she stepped toward me. Her face was pale, the practiced poise gone. "Grace," she said, reaching for my hand, "please, let's not ruin Christmas." I drew my hand back gently, almost kindly. It was ruined long before I got here. Dad's chair scraped sharply against the floor as he stood. His voice broke through the quiet, jagged and loud. "We raised you, you owe this family respect." I looked at him, at the man who'd spent a lifetime confusing control for love, and said softly, "Respect isn't a birthright, Dad. It's earned." The words hung there like frost in the air. Ethan stepped away from the table, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're finished," he muttered, walking toward the window. He pulled the curtain aside, watching the snow swallow the front yard. Completely finished. Mom started to cry then, quietly at first, like she was afraid to make a sound. "We just wanted everything to look beautiful," she whispered. "That's all we ever wanted." I turned toward her. "You got your wish," I said. "Beauty without soul." Her hand flew to her mouth. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Lauren's voice cracked as she lunged forward, grabbing my arm. "You'll regret this." I stared at her long enough for the words to sink into both of us. "I already regret wasting years waiting for you to be kind." Her grip faltered. She stepped back, eyes shining with tears she'd never let herself cry before. I reached for my coat, draped neatly over the back of the chair. The one small thing that still belonged entirely to me. I slid it on, smoothed the sleeve, and picked up my leather bag from the floor. Grace, Mom sobbed, "Don't walk out." I looked around the table. At the expensive plates, the flickering candles, the uneaten food. All of it curated to prove something no one in this room truly believed. "This was never a dinner," I said quietly. "It was a performance." Dad's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Lauren stood perfectly still, mascara streaking under her eyes. Ethan sank into his chair, shoulders slumped, whispering something I couldn't hear. From the corner of the room came the faint mechanical click of a camera. The photographer, the one Lauren had hired to capture candid family moments, hadn't moved since the shouting started. He must have hit the shutter without thinking. The flash went off, a quick burst of white light that caught me mid-step, one hand on the doorknob. I didn't turn around. Behind me, Mom's crying grew louder, the kind that comes from years of pretending things were fine. Dad muttered something about family loyalty, his voice hollow. Lauren whispered my name once, just once, her voice breaking on it. I opened the door. A rush of cold air swept in, carrying the smell of snow and pine from the porch wreath. For a moment, the contrast felt startling. The suffocating warmth of the house behind me, and the clean, biting cold of the world beyond. I stepped outside. The snow crunched under my boots, soft and deliberate. I could hear faint music still playing inside, the final chorus of some jazz carol looping on repeat. The front door stayed open for a heartbeat longer. I could sense them watching. The family I'd spent a lifetime trying to earn a place in, now frozen in the doorway of a house I owned. Then somewhere behind me the camera clicked one last time. I didn't turn back to see it. The light from inside spilled across the snow, golden and artificial, before fading as the door swung shut. The sound it made was small. Not a slam, just a firm final close. And then there was only quiet. I stood for a while on the walkway, letting the snow collect in my hair, melt down my collar. The air burned cold against my skin, but for the first time in years, it felt like air I could actually breathe. Through the frosted window, I could still make out their silhouettes. Lauren motionless. Dad's head bowed, Mom leaning against him, Ethan staring at the floor. The photographer lowered his camera, hesitated, then slowly turned it off. Inside, the candles flickered once, twice, and went out. I walked down the driveway, the world silent except for the soft crunch of snow underfoot and the faint echo of my own heartbeat. Somewhere behind me, the perfect picture they'd built began to crack, and when I reached the car, I didn't look back. I didn't need to, because I knew, from the stillness, from the quiet, that something inside that house had finally broken. By the time the sun rose over Bellevue, the storm had stopped, but another kind of storm had already started. Lauren woke to the vibration of her phone on the nightstand, the sound relentless like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. She squinted at the screen, still half asleep. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. Then she saw it, her face, her dining room, her perfect Christmas. Everywhere. The photo was unmistakable. The chandelier above the table, the golden place settings, her sequin dress glinting under the lights. And in the corner, me. The caption under it read, "Woman excluded from Christmas dinner, turns out to own the house." Within hours, it had spread across every platform. The hashtags filled the screen faster than she could scroll. Hashtag justice at Christmas. Hashtag family karma. Hashtag quiet revenge. There were hundreds of thousands of comments. That's how quiet revenge looks. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the rent. Grace is a legend. Lauren sat frozen, scrolling through one comment after another, her reflection warping in the phone's glass. Her followers, the same people who used to adore her, were tearing her apart. Downstairs, Mom and Dad sat in the living room, the TV glowing blue in the pale morning light. A local news anchor was speaking in that serious tone they reserve for human interest scandals. The now viral Christmas photo from Bellevue has sparked nationwide discussion about family privilege and power. Dad stared at the screen, his jaw tight, silent. Mom covered her face with both hands. "Richard," she whispered, "turn it off." He didn't. The camera cut to a reporter standing outside the house. Snow covered the yard like a confession that couldn't be hidden anymore. A neighbor was giving an interview. "We always thought they were the perfect family," she said. "Guess we were wrong." Back in the kitchen, Lauren's phone buzzed again. Another headline. Another article. Her hands were trembling now. She opened the app that had built her reputation, her curated, flawless world. And for the first time, she couldn't recognize herself there. Comments flooded every post. "Apologize to your sister. You deserved that lesson. This is what karma looks like in heels." Her breathing turned shallow. She deleted her account. The phone slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. Ethan stood in the doorway watching her. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. "They called from work," he said quietly. "I have to go in." "What did they say?" He hesitated. "My reputation is bad for business." Lauren didn't answer. The house felt too large, too quiet. For the first time, the perfect walls she'd polished for years felt like a cage. Across town, Mom sat by the window crying softly, while Dad paced the room, still muttering about respect and betrayal. The news kept playing the same footage on loop. Every headline, every segment, every comment came back to one image: the door closing behind me. By mid-afternoon, I'd seen enough of it too. I was in Portland, curled up on the sofa with a mug of coffee, the TV murmuring in the background. My face flashed across the screen again. That single frame the photographer had captured me walking away, snow falling around me, light spilling from the house behind. The anchor called it the moment of quiet justice. I turned off the TV. The silence that followed felt heavy but peaceful. Outside, snow melted into thin streams along the street, glinting under a weak winter sun. A knock at the door broke the stillness. Michael stepped in without waiting for me to invite him. He carried a newspaper folded neatly in half. "You're on the front page," he said, dropping it on the coffee table. Again. I looked down at the headline. "Sister's Secret Empire Exposes a Family Built on Appearances." My photo was below it. The same one from the night before. My face half-shadowed, my coat dusted with snow. I smiled, a small, tired smile. They finally noticed me. Took them 30 years. Michael sat across from me, studying my expression. "They're calling you the woman who redefined revenge." "Let them call me whatever they want," I said, taking a sip of coffee. The warmth spread slowly through my chest. "I didn't do it for them." He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you feel satisfied?" I thought about it. About the silence in that dining room. About Lauren's tears. Mom's shaking hands, Dad's voice cracking. About how easy it would have been to mistake exposure for closure. I looked out the window. The snow had started again, falling softer this time like a clean slate. "No," I said finally, "I just feel done." Michael nodded. "That's probably better." I leaned back on the couch, my gaze fixed on the gray sky beyond the glass. "It is." The world outside was quiet again, but this time it wasn't the silence of suppression. It was the silence that comes after a storm has finally passed. A week later, the storm had settled into memory. The city streets were clean again, snow pushed into neat white mounds along the sidewalks. When I walked into the downtown office of the Whitmore Family Trust, the air inside felt crisp, like the beginning of something new. The conference room was bright and orderly walls lined with quiet wealth framed certificates, minimalist art, polished oak furniture. Dr. Patel sat at the end of the table, his glasses low on his nose, a stack of papers neatly arranged in front of him. He looked up as I entered. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, with that calm, precise tone he always used. "Mrs. Eleanor has approved all revisions. You are now the sole executor." The words hung there for a moment before they settled in. Sole executor. He slid the documents toward me, and I felt the weight of them in my hands. Not just paper, but history rewritten. Before I could respond, the door opened behind me. The room shifted. My grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, stepped inside leaning lightly on her cane. 91 years old, silver hair pinned back neatly, eyes still sharp enough to cut through pretense. Her presence, even small and fragile, commanded the room more than any man I'd ever met. She smiled faintly. I saw everything she said, her voice steady. "On FaceTime. Your mother still doesn't realize I was on the call." I couldn't help a quiet laugh. "You always were ahead of everyone." She gave me that familiar, knowing look. "You did what I couldn't," she said. "You ended the cycle of vanity." For a second, I couldn't speak. All those years of silence, of being the unseen one, folded into that single acknowledgement. She nodded toward the folder. "Show me what you've built." I opened the file and spread out the proposal I'd been drafting since the night everything unraveled. The title at the top read Whitmore Dignity Fund. "This," I said, "is what comes next." Patel leaned forward as I explained. "The fund will convert the family's surplus real estate assets into grants and subsidized housing. It'll offer scholarships for women who've been overlooked. Single mothers, immigrants, and working-class families. People who've been told they don't belong in certain rooms." Eleanor listened without interrupting, her fingers tapping softly against her cane. I continued. "We'll also open mentorship programs in Portland and Seattle. Financial literacy, trade skills, housing support. Things I wish someone had given me when I started." "Dr. Patel smiled, his eyes warm. "A poetic form of justice," he said. I nodded. "It's not revenge anymore. It's restoration." Eleanor's gaze softened. "You've turned pain into something beautiful." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of release. She reached for the pen on the table, her hand trembling slightly, and signed her approval beside mine. "This family has chased appearances for 3 generations," she said. "It's time we stand for something that lasts." I took the pen next and wrote my name beneath hers. Grace E. Whitmore. The stroke of the final letter firm and clear. As I set the pen down, a calm I hadn't known in years settled over me. Dr. Patel gathered the documents. "Everything is official now. Within 2 weeks, the fund will be operational." Eleanor turned toward the window. The first flakes of snow had started to fall again, light and gentle, catching in the sunlight. She smiled faintly. "Look," she said. "Even the sky knows when to start over." I followed her gaze. The city stretched beyond the glass. Bright, clean, unburdened. For the first time, the snow didn't feel cold. Finally, it felt clean. By March 2025, the Whitmore name didn't open doors anymore. It mostly closed them. Lauren had moved out of the Eastwood Heights house in February. The neighbors said she left quietly before sunrise, a moving van idling at the curb while she stood on the porch one last time. A week later, she posted her final message to her remaining followers. Taking time off social media to find peace. It got thousands of likes, but no one believed her. Ethan didn't even make a post. He just disappeared, his name quietly removed from company websites and email directories. A friend later told me he'd transferred to a logistics firm in Denver under a different last name. Mom and Dad stayed in Bellevue, smaller now, somehow both of them. They sent rent checks on time every month. No more excuses. No more calls about extensions. Just simple envelopes with my company's name printed on the corner. Whitmore Capital Holdings. One afternoon, I came home to find a thicker envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a folded card in my father's handwriting. I hadn't seen it in years, but it was unmistakable. Slanted, stubborn, controlled. We didn't know how cruel we were. I'm sorry. I sat at my kitchen table, the late winter light falling over the words. For a long while, I didn't move. Then I folded the card neatly and slid it back into the envelope. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't reply either. Some wounds don't close with apologies. They seal with distance. Spring came early that year. Portland bloomed in pale pinks and soft greens, the air smelling faintly of rain and renewal. One Saturday morning, I drove to the suburbs to visit my Aunt Diane Brooks, my mother's younger sister and the only person in the family who'd never treated me like a disappointment. Her small house felt warm the moment I stepped in sunlight, filtering through lace curtains the smell of fresh bread in the air. She opened the door with her usual bright smile. "There she is," she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like lavender and sugar. "You did what needed to be done." I laughed softly against her shoulder. I didn't plan for all of it to explode like that. She stepped back, studying me. Sometimes the truth has to blow up before people notice it. Her son, Henry, now in college, appeared from the living room with his laptop in hand. "Aunt Grace, you've got to see this," he said, grinning. "You're viral again." "Oh no," I said, half groaning. He turned the screen toward me. Someone had compiled a montage. Clips from the news, screenshots of comments and stills of me walking out of Lauren's house that Christmas night. The video was titled Grace Whitmore, The Quiet Storm. I watched for a moment, the background music swelling over my face, frozen mid-turn in falling snow. Henry laughed. "People say you're like some kind of hero for standing up to them." I smiled faintly. Let's hope they learned the right lesson. He raised an eyebrow, which is, "That silence isn't weakness," I said. "But it can be mercy, or consequence. Depends on who you give it to." He looked at me for a second, then nodded slowly. "That's actually kind of badass." Diane rolled her eyes. Language, Henry. We all laughed, the kind of laugh that comes when something heavy finally loosens its grip. That afternoon I drove home with the windows cracked, the cool wind brushing through the car. The city was waking up again. Farmers markets, kids on bikes, the smell of coffee drifting from open doors. For the first time, the world felt like it wasn't closing in on me. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw a small white envelope sitting in my mailbox. No stamp, just my name written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a short letter on thick paper. "Dear Ms. Whitmore, because of you, I have a home. I got the apartment through the Dignity Fund. My son and I sleep without fear now. Thank you for giving us a place to start over." Signed beneath it, Maria Alvarez Scholarship recipient. I read it once, then again, then a third time. The words blurred and I felt a warmth rise behind my eyes I didn't bother to fight. I sat on the steps of my porch, the letter trembling slightly in my hand, the evening light turning gold across the rooftops. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime rang soft and slow. For years, my silence had been a wall, a way to survive what they said, what they did, what they refused to see. But now, for the first time, that same silence had built something that lived beyond me. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside me. The air smelled like wet earth and new beginnings. For the first time, my silence built something instead of breaking me. Christmas came again before I realized it. Portland was wrapped in quiet light that night. Soft snow falling on rooftops, the sound of laughter drifting from porches, the city aglow but calm. Inside my small cream-colored house, warmth radiated from the kitchen, where the ovens still hummed and the scent of cinnamon and ginger hung in the air. The table was simple this year. Just polished wood, mismatched plates, and a few candles flickering in glass jars. No photographers, no perfect centerpieces, just people who showed up because they wanted to. Michael poured red wine into glasses, humming along with the faint jazz playing from the speaker. "You outdid yourself, Grace," he said, nodding at the roast chicken on the table. I laughed. "It's edible. That's all that matters." Aunt Diane was arranging a bowl of salad near the candles, humming softly. "It's perfect," she said, then added with a grin, mostly because no one told me to coordinate the napkins. Henry, now taller than me and twice as confident, raised his glass of cider. "This," he said dramatically, "is the real family goal." Everyone laughed, and I did too. "Finally," I said, looking around the table, no filters. We passed dishes, told stories, interrupted each other mid-sentence. All the things that used to be considered impolite at the old Whitmore dinners. Michael told a story about getting lost on his way to a client meeting. Diane teased him about his terrible sense of direction. Someone spilled wine, and no one gasped. The sound of easy laughter filled the room, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was performing. I brought out the gingerbread cake last, still warm, its sugary scent cutting through the winter chill that lingered near the window. Everyone leaned forward as I set it down, and the candles flickered higher for a moment, as if the room itself had exhaled. Henry clapped his hands. "Okay, Aunt Grace officially wins Christmas." I smiled. "I'll accept my award and cookies." The snow outside thickened, drifting lazily past the window panes. I caught my reflection in the glass. The same face, the same eyes, but softer now, at peace. Last Christmas I'd sat next to the kitchen in someone else's house, close enough to smell the trash bin, and hear laughter I wasn't part of. This year I sat at my own table, surrounded by people who didn't care about appearance's only connection. Sometimes losing your seat is how you find your place. The tablet on the counter buzzed. Michael picked it up, smiling. "It's for you." I walked over, and there she was. Grandma Eleanor sitting in her favorite chair, wrapped in a knitted shawl, the glow of the fireplace behind her. Her sharp eyes softened the moment she saw me. "Merry Christmas, dear," she said, her voice warm and steady. "I'm proud of you." My throat tightened. "Thank you, Grandma. Merry Christmas." She smiled, the kind of smile that looked like both love and relief. "You built something that will last. That's all I ever wanted for this family." The screen flickered slightly before the call ended, her image fading into the quiet hum of the room. I turned back toward the table where everyone waited with their glasses raised. I lifted mine, too. "To dignity," I said. "To peace." "To peace," they echoed, and the clinking of glasses filled the room soft and clear. The laughter returned low and comfortable. Someone put another log on the fire, and the scent of pine filled the air. Outside, snow fell steady and soundless, blanketing the street in silver. Inside, the world felt warm. Not the kind of warmth that comes from pretending, but the kind that grows from honesty and forgiveness, even when forgiveness is quiet. I leaned back in my chair, the flicker of candlelight dancing across familiar faces. Michael's easy grin. Diane's kind eyes, Henry's youthful energy. This was family now, not by blood, but by choice. And as the night settled into stillness, I realized something simple, but true peace doesn't arrive with applause. It comes when you stop needing an audience. If you've ever been dismissed, underestimated, or made to feel small, remember this. Silence isn't weakness. It's the quiet strength of knowing your worth and walking away from anything that refuses to see it. That's how you reclaim your value. That's how you win your peace.